Sensors must be malfunctioning again, Senior Observer Krintar muttered, their forearms dancing across the holographic control panel of the Unscathed space station's main observatory. Their crystalline eyes refracted the red glow from the massive window overlooking the Crimson Nebula, casting tiny rainbow patterns across their iridescent scales. The readings couldn't be right. Nothing survived in the Crimson Nebula. Nothing. The massive cloud of radioactive gas and microscopic crystalline particles had claimed countless lives and vessels over the centuries. Even the most advanced shielding technology the Galactic Council had developed couldn't withstand more than a few minutes of exposure. "Computer, run diagnostic check on all external sensors," Krintar commanded, their secondary voice box producing the necessary subsonic frequencies for the station's AI. "Diagnostic complete. All sensors functioning within normal parameters," the computer responded in its maddeningly calm tone. Krintar's scales shifted from their normal blue-green to a worried purple. "Then explain why I'm reading an unshielded vessel approaching the outer boundary of the Crimson Nebula by the first ones, at standard cruising speed?" The massive observation window of the Unscathed space station offered an unparalleled view of the deadly phenomenon. The station itself orbited at a carefully calculated safe distance, protected by 17 layers of energy shielding and the most advanced particle dispersal system ever created. It served as both a research station and a warning beacon, making sure no unfortunate vessels accidentally strayed into the lethal zone. "Alert," the computer chimed. "Unknown vessel has now entered standard communication range, attempting to establish contact." Krintar's scales rippled with anxiety as they activated the emergency protocols. "This is Senior Observer Krintar of the Unscathed space station. Unknown vessel, you are approaching a Class X hazard zone. Repeat, you are approaching a Class X hazard zone. Immediate course correction is required. Please acknowledge." The response came through with surprising clarity, considering the interference from the nebula. A strange, oddly cheerful voice replied, "Hey there, this is Captain Sarah Chen of the Earth vessel Lucky Star. Thanks for the heads up, but no worries. Just passing through." Krintar's scales turned pure white with shock. Their tertiary heart actually stopped beating for a moment. "Station, confirm origin of transmission." "Confirmed. Transmission originates from previously unknown species designation, human." Krintar slammed all four hands down on the emergency alert panel. Sirens began to wail throughout the station as they watched the impossible unfold on their screens. This was either going to be the shortest rescue operation in history, or something unprecedented was about to happen. "All senior staff to the observatory," they announced over the station-wide comm. "We have a situation." The observatory filled quickly, various species of the galactic community crowding around the massive window. Chief Medical Officer Plex arrived last, their hoverchair whirring softly as they navigated through the gathered crowd. The Medusan's tentacles were already extended from their environment suit, multiple data tablets floating in their grasp. "What do we have?" Plex asked, their translator converting the harmonious whistles into standard galactic speech. "Another foolish attempt to cross the Crimson." "Worse," Krintar replied, their scales still showing traces of white anxiety. "They're not even trying to go around it. They're heading straight through." Security Officer Rez, a towering Mantidean, clicked their mandibles in amusement. 10 credits say they don't last 5 minutes once they hit the particle barrier." "Make it 20, chirped Navigator Linpo, their bioluminescent antennae flashing with excitement. "Remember that Valaxian cruise ship last cycle? Their shields lasted at least 7 minutes before the crystalline particles shredded them." Plex's tentacles waved in disapproval. "This is hardly the time for—" "I'll put 30 credits on 8 minutes, interrupted Engineering Chief Borax, their gelatinous form rippling with each word. "My scans show their hull composition is unlike anything in our database. Might give them a few extra minutes of survival time." The betting pool grew as quickly as the crowd, with various crew members shouting increasingly morbid predictions. Chief Medical Officer Plex recorded each bet with methodical precision, despite their obvious disapproval. Their species had an uncontrollable compulsion for data collection, even when it involved calculating odds of death. "You're all forgetting about the Dreadnought incident," rumbled Lieutenant Commander Vex, their rocky exterior grinding slightly as they spoke. "Most advanced battleship in the Galactic Fleet. Triple reinforced shields. Best crew we had. They thought they could force their way through." A hushed silence fell over the observatory. Everyone remembered. The Dreadnought had barely made it a quarter of the way into the Crimson Nebula before the crystalline particles overwhelmed their shields. The radiation had turned the crew to liquid before they could even send a distress signal. The ship itself had emerged on the other side, 9 months later, as nothing more than a floating tomb of molecular ash. "Attention," the station's computer announced. "Unknown vessel Lucky Star has now entered the outer perimeter of the Crimson Nebula." The crew pressed closer to the window. The small ship was now visible to the naked eye, a tiny speck of silver against the swirling red clouds of certain death. "Still no shield signature detected," Krintar reported, their voice trembling. "They're going in completely unprotected." "Impossible," Plex whistled, their tentacles frantically analyzing the data streams. "The background radiation alone should have fried their systems by now. The crystalline particles should be scoring their hull. They should be dead." Captain Sarah Chen's cheerful voice crackled through the comm system again. "Sorry to disappoint, but we're doing just fine. Though I have to say your nebula's putting on quite a light show. Beautiful stuff." The observatory erupted in chaos. Credits changed hands rapidly as bet after bet was proven wrong. The small vessel continued its steady course, seemingly unaffected by the lethal environment surrounding it. "Wait!" Borax burbled, their gelatinous form pressing against the observation window. They're slowing down. Are they actually planning to stop? In there?" The answer came moments later as the Lucky Star indeed began to decelerate, coming to a relative stop in one of the densest portions of the Crimson Nebula. The next transmission made Krintar's scales shift through every color in their species' emotional spectrum. "Hope you folks don't mind, but I need to step outside for a bit. Got to check something on the hull. Back in a jiffy." "No!" The collective scream of the observatory crew created such a cacophony that the station's automatic dampeners kicked in. Security Officer Rez's mandibles clattered so hard they nearly cracked. Navigator Lin Po's antennae went completely dark, a sign of extreme distress in their species. "Computer, give me everything you have on humans, now!" Krintar demanded, their scales cycling between emergency red and sickly green. "Species human, origin, Earth, classification unknown, warning limited data available, notable characteristics, binary gender, carbon-based endoskeletal structure." "Skip the basics!" Chief Medical Officer Plex interrupted, their tentacles whipping through holographic displays. "What's their environmental tolerance?" The computer paused for an unusually long time. "Error? Data appears to be corrupted. Recorded environmental tolerances exceed known biological possibilities." "How many of these humans have we encountered before?" Lieutenant Commander Vex rumbled, tiny pebbles falling from their form, a sign of extreme stress. "This is the first confirmed contact," the computer replied. Engineering Chief Borax bubbled anxiously. "Then they don't know. They can't know what they're about to do. Quick, give them the numbers." Krintar slammed their emergency broadcast button. "Captain Chen, you must abort. Current nebula conditions are radiation levels at 15,000 rem and rising, crystalline particle density at 890 parts per million, temperature fluctuating between 200 and minus 100 degrees standard, caustic gas concentrations at—" "Oh, neat," Sarah's voice came back, somehow even more cheerful than before. "Those crystals are what's making everything so sparkly. They're gorgeous. Reminds me of skiing in a blizzard back home." The entire observatory crew watched in horror as a small airlock on the Lucky Star began to cycle. Chief Medical Officer Plex's tentacles tied themselves in knots as they calculated survival odds. Even if they have some form of advanced protection we've never seen, the crystalline particles will tear through it in seconds. The radiation will... "Hey, quick question," Sarah interrupted again. "Your station's got a compatible airlock, right? Because I'd love to pop in for a chat after I finish my hull check. Maybe grab a coffee if you've got any." Security Officer Rez's exoskeleton made an ominous cracking sound. "They think they're going to survive long enough to visit. This is beyond delusional. This is—" The airlock finished cycling. Every being in the observatory pressed against the windows, some stacking on top of each other, all desperate to witness what they assumed would be the last moments of the first human they'd ever encountered. Several recording devices whirred to life, documenting what would surely become a legendary cautionary tale. Through the swirling red clouds of the nebula, a figure emerged. No protective bubble, no energy shield, no specialized environment suit. Just a simple pressure suit that looked barely more sophisticated than basic spaceware. "That's—" Navigator Lin Po's voice squeaked through their translator. "That's not even rated for deep space exposure. It's comfortable." Sarah's voice came through again. "Little warm, maybe. Might have to adjust the AC. Now, let's see what's making that funny noise on my port side." The human proceeded to casually walk across their ship's hull, occasionally stopping to examine something with a handheld tool, completely ignoring the fact that they were surrounded by enough radiation to liquefy most known species, crystalline particles that could slice through battleship armor, and temperatures that alternated between plasma hot and cosmic cold. Grintar turned to Chief Medical Officer Plex, their scales now a solid white of absolute shock. "Are you still recording their life signs?" Plex's tentacles had gone completely rigid. "Yes, and according to these readings, they're humming." Chief Medical Officer Plex's monitoring equipment started smoking. Not metaphorically. Actual wisps of smoke curled from their most sensitive scanning devices as they attempted to process the impossible data before them. "This must be some kind of malfunction," Plex whistled frantically, their tentacles now completely tangled. "The readings suggest the human's body temperature is maintaining stability in an environment that fluctuates between plasma hot and absolute zero. That's... Look." Navigator Lin Po's antennae flashed in rapid pulses of disbelief. "They're using a simple magnetic tether. A tether in the Crimson Nebula. Those things barely hold up in normal space conditions." Sarah Chen, apparently oblivious to the fact that she was defying several universal constants, had indeed attached herself to her ship with what looked like standard magnetic climbing gear. She was now hanging upside down, pointing some kind of primitive torch at her ship's hull plating. "Oh, found it!" Her cheerful voice came through the comms. "Just a loose panel making that rattling noise. Give me 5 minutes to tighten these bolts." Security Officer Rez's mandibles clattered in a rhythm that the station's translator couldn't even process. 5 minutes? 5 minutes? Do they not understand that they're currently being bombarded by enough radiation to power a small sun? Engineering Chief Borax had transformed into a near-perfect sphere, their species' ultimate expression of stress. The crystalline particles, they're bouncing off her suit. Just bouncing off like raindrops, Lieutenant Commander Vex finished, their rocky surface developing several new stress fractures. "They're bouncing off like common raindrops." The observatory's scientific equipment continued to short-circuit one by one. Each device seemed to reach its own personal limit of impossibility before giving up entirely. A particularly advanced radiation detector simply disassembled itself, its components neatly arranging themselves into what appeared to be a surrender flag. "Interesting atmospheric composition you've got here," Sarah commented as she worked, her voice carrying the same tone someone might use to discuss mild weather. "Reminds me of that time I had to fix a leak in my grandmother's greenhouse." Though her tomato plants were a bit more aggressive than these crystal things. Crintar's scales had gone beyond white and into a new color that their species had never displayed before. "Computer, compare current conditions to known survival limits of carbon-based lifeforms." "Unable to compute," the station AI responded, its voice showing signs of strain. Query exceeds mathematical possibilities. Suggested alternative. Recategorize subject as non-carbon-based life form. But our scans clearly show a carbon-based structure, Plex protested, waving a tentacle at their last functioning scanner. Along with, wait, these cellular readings, that can't be right. According to this, their cells are actively adapting to the radiation. They're using it. Sarah had finished her repairs and was now taking what she called a quick look around at the nebula. She pulled out a small device that the station's computers identified as a primitive imaging capturer, a camera, and began taking pictures. "The colors out here are amazing," she exclaimed. "The way the crystals catch the light. Oh, did you see that? That wave of plasma just made the prettiest pattern. Hang on, let me get a better angle." The human proceeded to disconnect her tether, causing several observatory crew members to faint, and used her suit's maneuvering thrusters to drift further into the nebula. The crystalline particles, which had previously carved through the strongest known metals in the galaxy like they were made of smoke, seemed to part around her like a gentle curtain. "Radiation levels in her immediate vicinity are actually dropping," reported a junior science officer who had been manning the last working sensor. "It's as if the nebula is adapting to her presence. Or she's adapting to it. I don't even know which is more impossible anymore." Sarah's voice came through again, now tinged with what sounded like disappointment. "Well, better head in before my camera battery dies. Earth tech still has some limitations, unfortunately. Though I've got to say, your nebula here is probably the most relaxing space phenomenon I've photographed this month. Last week I was documenting a magnetar storm. Now that was tricky to shoot. The magnetic fields kept trying to steal my camera." The observatory crew watched in collective shock as she casually made her way back to her ship, pausing only to wave at their window. Several crew members waved back automatically, their brains apparently deciding that normal social protocols were the only thing they could still process in this situation. "Hey," Sarah called out, "that offer for coffee still stands. Just need to park my ship somewhere. Any suggestions? Preferably with a good view of the nebula. I'd love to get some long exposure shots later." Engineering Chief Borax, still perfectly spherical with stress, managed to burble out, We have a standard docking bay on the station's far side, but the nebula's radiation—" "Oh, don't worry about that," Sarah laughed. "A little radiation never hurt anyone. Well, except for that one time in college, but in my defense, nobody told me the quantum physics lab was running tests that day. Now, which way to your docking bay?" The station's decontamination chamber had never worked so hard in its existence. Warning lights flashed as it attempted to process the various impossibilities that had just walked through its doors. Sarah Chen stood in the chamber, still in her simple pressure suit, smiling and waving at the crowd of aliens gathering behind the triple-reinforced observation window. "Warning," the station's computer announced, its voice carrying an unmistakable note of confusion. "Decontamination cycle unable to complete. Unknown biological anomalies detected. Recommend immediate quarantine protocols." "Oh, sorry about that," Sarah called out, reaching up to remove her helmet. "My cells tend to get a bit excited after a nice radiation bath. Give them a few minutes to calm down." Security Officer Rez nearly fainted as their mandibles locked up in shock. Chief Medical Officer Plex's tentacles went completely limp. Even the ever-stoic Lieutenant Commander Vex shed a few pebbles in surprise. "Stop!" Krintar screamed, their scales flashing emergency patterns. "The chamber's atmosphere isn't properly calibrated yet. The residual radiation alone could—" "It's totally fine," Sarah assured them, her helmet already off, revealing a face with an alarmingly exposed respiratory system. She shook out her hair, releasing what the sensors identified as several million charged particles. "Though I should probably warn you, I might glow a little bit for the next few hours. Side effect of the nebula's particular isotope combination. Actually makes for great mood lighting at parties." The decontamination chamber's computer made a sound that could only be described as an electronic whimper. Unable to establish baseline for decontamination. Subject simultaneously exhibits radiation levels exceeding lethal thresholds and optimal life signs. Logic systems failing. Requesting immediate software update. Is your coffee machine working at least? Sarah asked, completely ignoring the various alarms still blaring around her. I brought some beans from Earth just in case. They're extra tasty after being naturally roasted by stellar radiation. Engineering Chief Borax, who had finally managed to lose their spherical stress shape, immediately reverted back upon hearing this. You exposed organic consumables to the nebula's radiation? Deliberately? Sure. Sarah nodded enthusiastically. Really brings out the flavor. Though I should mention, the last batch might have gained mild sentience. Had a lovely chat with my morning coffee yesterday. The chamber's computer finally gave up. With a defeated beep, it declared, "Standard protocols insufficient. Implementing new protocol. Acceptance of impossibility. Chamber door opening. Please ensure all existential crises are properly contained before proceeding." As Sarah stepped out into the station proper, the assembled crew noticed something extraordinary. The radiation warning indicators near her were indeed flashing, but they seemed to be dancing? The patterns matched perfectly with her humming, creating an impromptu light show. "This is a lovely station you've got here," she said, looking around appreciatively. "Though you might want to adjust your radiation shielding. It's a bit excessive. Makes everything feel a bit stuffy, you know." Chief Medical Officer Plex, whose tentacles had tied themselves into what mathematicians would later identify as an entirely new type of knot, finally found their voice. "Excessive? Excessive? Those shields are the only thing keeping the nebula from reducing us all to our component atoms." Sarah blinked in surprise. "Really? Huh. I guess that explains all the warning buoys we passed. Thought they were just for decoration. Like those cute little danger lava signs back home in Hawaii." The entire alien crew stared at her in silent horror. "Speaking of home," Sarah continued brightly, pulling out her camera, "want to see some pictures? Got some great shots of my backyard during last month's solar flare storm. The aurora really brought out the colours in my pet tardigrades forest." The station's conference room had never hosted such a tense meeting. Holograms of Earth's environmental data floated in the center of the room, causing various alien species to experience everything from mild panic attacks to complete molecular destabilization. "This has to be a mistake," Krintar insisted, their scales rapidly cycling through colors of disbelief. "No planet could possibly—" "Oh no, that's pretty accurate," Sarah interrupted, casually sipping her glowing coffee. "Though it's missing the really fun stuff, like our magnetic pole reversals, supervolcano potential, and that cute little extinction-level asteroid that swings by every few centuries." Chief Medical Officer Plex's tentacles had given up on maintaining any semblance of order, and were now wrapped around their hover chair like survival cables. "Your species evolved on a planet that's bombarded by radiation from a dangerously unstable star, has a corrosive atmosphere, is constantly releasing toxic gases, experiences regular tectonic upheavals, and is literally being torn apart by its own magnetic field." "Don't forget the weather," Sarah added cheerfully. "Nothing beats a good Category 5 hurricane for testing your home insurance. Though the radioactive lightning storms are my personal favorite. Great for charging my devices in a pinch." The station's computer had been attempting to update the galactic classification system for the past hour. It finally spoke up, its voice carrying a note of defeat. "Error. Unable to classify planet Earth. Current categories insufficient. Suggestion. Create new classification. Deathworld Plus. Deathworld Supreme. Deathworld. Nightmare Mode." "Speaking of classification," Lieutenant Commander Vex rumbled, several new cracks appearing in their rocky surface, "we need to discuss your species' environmental resistance numbers." "Oh, those are pretty flexible," Sarah shrugged, her skin still giving off a faint, pleasant glow from her nebula walk. "We've got this neat trick called adaptation, like how my cells are currently using your nebula's radiation to enhance their repair functions. Comes in handy during solar storms back home." Engineering Chief Borax, who had been analyzing Sarah's pressure suit, suddenly bubbled in shock. This isn't even a radiation suit. It's just standard pressure equipment with... Are these patches? Yeah, had a few micrometeorite incidents last month, Sarah nodded. Nothing some duct tape couldn't fix, though I did have to use the extra strength stuff after that close call with the plasma vent. Security Officer Rez's mandibles began producing a sound that the station's linguists would later classify as hysterical laughter in clicks. We're going to need to completely revise the galactic safety protocols, Krintar announced, their scales settling on a new color that seemed to represent bureaucratic resignation. Everything we considered lethal is apparently just mildly inconvenient for humans. Oh, not everything, Sarah reassured them. We still have to be careful about some things, like my aunt's cooking, or Australian wildlife, or trying to parallel park in New York City during rush hour. Now those are genuine hazards. The station's computer made one final attempt at classification. Proposal: designate humans as walking violations of universal constants and be done with it. That works, Sarah agreed, finishing her coffee. Though you might want to add a footnote about our tendency to keep dangerous pets. My tardigrade collection back home would love this nebula. Think I could take a few crystals as souvenirs? They'd make great toys for them. The entire alien crew watched in a mixture of horror and awe as their fundamental understanding of the universe continued to crumble before their eyes. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen, the human who had casually strolled through what they had considered certain death, was already planning her next adventure. By the way, she added, pulling out a star chart, anyone know anything about that black hole cluster in the next sector? I've been meaning to get some close-up shots for my photography blog. My followers love a good space catastrophe. The sound of multiple alien species, fainting simultaneously, echoed through the station, while the computer quietly began composing a new entry for the galactic records. Humans, approach with caution, though they probably won't notice.